Inside of Westminster Abbey, there is a forgotten, lost and undisturbed Queen of England who very few people know about. There is little tomb or memorial to Anne Neville, the wife of one of the most notorious kings England has ever had, Richard III. She reigned as queen for less than 2 years and succumbed to a deadly disease, tuberculosis, on the day of an eclipse, and some people thought that this was an omen, marking the fall of her husband. Within a few months of his queen's death, Richard III was slain in battle, and the Tudor dynasty began. But because of the short time after her death that her husband died too, there was little time for a monument or tomb to be created, and King Henry VII, the first Tudor king, did not bother to have her grave marked. And because of this, for around 500 years, the grave and resting place of one of England's shortest reigning queens was lost to time, and still today, the actual location of her grave is somewhat of a mystery. Today we look inside the coffin of the undisturbed Queen of England, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Anne Neville was born on the 11th of June 1456 at Warwick Castle, the younger daughter of Richard Neville, the 16th Earl of Warwick, and Anne Beauchamp, heiress to the vast Beauchamp estates. The Neville family was one of the most powerful noble houses of the 15th century, with the Earl of Warwick wielding enormous political influence during the Wars of the Roses. Known as the Kingmaker, Warwick initially supported the Yorkist cause, helping Edward IV secure the throne from Henry VI of Lancaster. Anne grew up in a world of wealth and privilege, but also of political uncertainty. Her childhood coincided with a period of intense civil war, and as a noblewoman, her marriage prospects were of great strategic importance. Alongside her older sister Isabel, Anne was considered a valuable prize for any noble family seeking to strengthen its claim or force alliances. In 1469, Warwick's relationship with King Edward IV broke down. Initially Edward's staunch ally, Warwick became disillusioned with the king's policies and his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville, which threatened Warwick's influence. In a dramatic shift of allegiance, Warwick defected to the Lancastrian side, aligning himself with his former enemy, Queen Margaret of Anjou, the formidable wife of Henry VI. To cement this alliance, Warwick arranged for Anne, then only 14, to marry Margaret's son, Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales and heir to the Lancastrian throne. The marriage took place in the December of 1470 at Angers Cathedral in France, and as Edward's wife, Anne became the Princess of Wales and a potential future Queen of England if the Lancastrians could reclaim the crown. However, the union was short-lived, and in April 1471 Warwick was killed at the Battle of Barnet, a decisive Yorkist victory, and just a month later Anne's young husband Edward was killed, most likely during or after the Battle of Tewkesbury on the 4th of May 1471, when the Lancastrian forces were crushed by Edward IV, and Anne, now a teenage widow and a political pawn, was captured by the Yorkists. Her mother-in-law, Queen Margaret, was taken prisoner, and the Lancastrian cause effectively collapsed. Following the Lancastrian defeat, Anne's future became uncertain. Some accounts suggest that she was placed in the custody of her brother-in-law, George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, who had married her sister Isabel. George, fearing that Anne's vast inheritance as a Neville heiress would diminish his own holdings if she remarried, may have attempted to keep her secluded. It was at this time that Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, Edward IV's younger brother, expressed an interest in marrying Anne. Richard had spent part of his youth under the guardianship of Warwick and was likely acquainted with Anne from an early age. A marriage between Anne and Richard would strengthen his power and claim to the Neville inheritance. According to later accounts, Richard had to rescue Anne from her brother-in-law's custody. The marriage negotiations were fraught with disputes over her dowry and estates, but the couple eventually wed in 1472, when Anne was about 16 years old. Richard and Anne settled in the north of England, where Richard served as the king's lieutenant, governing the region with efficiency and gaining a reputation for fairness and loyalty. For the next decade, Anne lived relatively quietly as the Duchess of Gloucester. She and Richard resided at Middleham Castle in Yorkshire, which became their principal home. It was there, around 1473, that Anne gave birth to her only child, Edward of Middleham. The boy would become the centre of Anne's affections and hopes for the future. Anne's years as Duchess were perhaps the most peaceful of her life, and Richard proved to be a devoted husband, and their household was known for its generosity and piety. However, the stability of their life would soon be shattered by the dynastic turmoil that engulfed the House of York after Edward IV's sudden death in April of 1483. Edward IV's death set off a chain of events that dramatically changed Anne's life. Richard, as the king's brother, was named Lord Protector for Edward's young son, Edward V. However, Richard seized the throne himself, claiming that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been invalid and that the children of that union were illegitimate. On the 26th of June 1483, Richard was declared king as Richard III, and Anne was crowned Queen Consort at Westminster Abbey on the 6th of July. At 27 years old, Anne found herself at the pinnacle of power. She was the first Queen Consort to be crowned alongside her husband since the Norman Conquest, an event that underscored her importance in legitimising Richard's rule. Despite the grandeur of her coronation, Anne's reign as queen was overshadowed by tragedy and political unrest. Rumours swirled about the fate of the princes in the Tower, Edward V and his younger brother Richard of Shrewsbury, who had disappeared from the Tower of London after their uncle's usurpation. These rumours tarnished Richard and Anne's reputations, casting a dark shadow over their rule. Anne's greatest personal blow came with the death of her only son, Edward of Middleham, in April 1484, at the age of around 10 or 11. The loss devastated both Anne and Richard, who had no other children to secure their dynasty. Chroniclers noted that Anne's health began to decline rapidly following her son's death, and she then grew increasingly frail. Her grief was compounded by political instability. Richard III faced growing opposition from Henry Tudor, a Lancastrian claimant exiled in Brittany, who would soon challenge him for the throne. As Richard's position became more precarious, rumours circulated that he intended to divorce Anne and marry his niece Elizabeth of York to strengthen the claim. While there is little evidence to support this, the speculation suggests the tension and uncertainty of the time. Anne Neville then died on the 16th of March 1485 at the age of 28, likely from tuberculosis or another chronic illness. Now, there is actually very little recorded in regards to the Queen's funeral, and specifically where Anne was actually buried. It was claimed that King Richard III attended the funeral of his wife and that he cried a lot. But at the time there were rumours that Richard had poisoned her so that he could marry his niece Elizabeth of York. The king addressed the rumours, and it was claimed that, in a loud and distinct voice, he showed his grief and displeasure aforesaid, and said it never came into his thoughts or mind to marry in such manner wise, nor willingly nor glad of the death of his queen, but as sorry and in heart as heavy as man might be. Richard III was broken, but we know that her funeral took place inside of Westminster Abbey, and that a significant amount of money had been on a funeral with honours no less than befitting the burial of a queen. The surviving records in Westminster Abbey state that £42.12 was assigned for her burial. A list of burials inside of the Abbey also claim that Anne Neville was buried on the south side of the sanctuary, and it was claimed in 1530 that her grave is by the south door that does lead into St Edward's Chapel. This is the most holy and important part of the abbey, next to the shrine of Edward the Confessor, surrounded by other medieval kings. Today, this part is inaccessible and cannot be viewed. And also there is also not a tomb marking her site. Locating Anne Neville's body is tricky. For around 500 years, her burial site also remained unmarked. The grave of the Queen was lost to time. But in the year 1866, whilst some work was being done on the area south to the high altar, a heavy lead coffin was discovered alone, lying inside of a grave in the rough location of Queen Anne. There was some debate as to whether this was her remains or the remains of another Queen Anne, Anne of Cleves, the fourth wife of King Henry VIII, who is also buried close by. Now, the fact her burial site is relatively lost may have actually saved Queen Anne from having her coffin broken into, or her burial vault being disturbed. Inside of the abbey, during the Victorian period, many of the vaults of royals were looked inside of, and this means that being undisturbed, Anne Neville's body, presuming it was embalmed as royal custom and was wrapped in a thick cerecloth, may be as fresh as the day she died. There is a relatively good chance that the skin on her corpse still remains, and that if she's buried with a crown on her head or in her royal robes, that these still exist. In 1960, an enamelled shield of arms with a brass plate was placed on the wall of the south ambulatory relatively close to the gravesite, and this marked her site of burial and claimed, in person, she was seemly, amiable, and beauteous, and according to the interpretations of her name, Anne full gracious, but this is not of course the exact spot and is only a memorial. Today, the grave of Anne Neville remains a mystery, and the true burial site is one of Westminster Abbey's secrets. She is surrounded in the rough location of her grave by medieval kings and queens and lies close, allegedly, to the most holy part of the incredible abbey. But in her life, she is best remembered for being the wife of one of the most notorious kings that England has ever had. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.